Episode 16, Back to the Somme. With the attack of the 1st of July failed, the 2nd Essex still found itself holding the British front line, and whilst most people focused on the 1st of July 1916, the offensive on the Somme was to continue until near the end of the year. During the month of July, the 2nd Essex would find themselves in and out of the front line, gradually getting new reinforcements and trying to recover from the impact of the attack on the 1st of July, which was ultimately the most costly day for the battalion in the whole war. The attack didn't happen in isolation, and the British and French attacked and continued to attack across a wide area of the Somme. On the 12th of July, the battalion was visited by the corps commander, and he expressed his admiration for their efforts during the attack, and in the regimental history by Burroughs lists the following statement made by Lieutenant General Sir Alma Hunter Weston. "We had the most difficult part of the line to attack. The Germans had fortified it with skill and immense labour for many months." It then continues, "By your splendid attack, you held the German forces here in the north and enabled our friends in the south, both British and French, to achieve the brilliant success that they have had. Therefore, though we did not do all that we hoped to do, you have more than pulled your weight, and you, and even more glorious colleagues who have proceeded as across the Great Divide, have nobly done your duty." As the month of July finished, the 2nd Essex found themselves moving out of the line and moving back up into Belgium, to a town called Poperinge, or Pop as it was often called by the troops. This was to give them a sustained period out of the line, organising and training themselves and assimilating replacements, before they went back into the front line, and when they did, it was to familiar territory to veterans of the battalion in the area of St Julien, with places such as Algerian Cottage, Irish Farm, which is just off the bottom southern edge of this map, Irish Farm, Dead Man's Farm, No Man's Cottage, all places that we've encountered before because of the battalion's time there early in 1915 in the Battle of the Second Ypres. And this has been covered in previous episodes. I'd urge you to kind of go back and catch those up if you haven't. For the remainder of August, and for most of September, the battalion was to complete a cycle of moving in and out of the trenches in this area and going back to rest areas around the town of Pop. Whilst in the front line on the 16th of August, a German deserter came into their trenches, and bearing in mind the experience the battalion had had on the Somme, was probably quite lucky to actually be taken prisoner. In mid-September, Noel Irwin, who we've met many a time before, returned to the battalion, but now as a captain. And towards the end of September, it was to move back onto the Somme area and prepare itself for taking part in the further stages of that offensive. One curious story noted in the battalion war diary was on the 30th of September 1916, 2nd Lieutenant Perkins was tried by Field General Court-Martial for being asleep in a dugout during the hours of morning stand to. At the time, it was quite a well-known procedure for just before it's got light in the morning, just before it got dark in the evening, to have your troops standing by, because it was thought it was a classic time for the enemy to attack. And being found asleep on duty is quite a serious offence. Some soldiers, for example, were executed for this, shot at dawn, if you want to think of it that way, for being asleep on sentry duty. So I'm not sure whether being asleep in a dugout was perhaps seen differently, but either way, Lieutenant Perkins was acquitted. It's interesting that it actually makes it into the battalion war diary, because that was written by one of his contemporaries, and also that his crime was reported in the first place, because it would only be people in his immediate grouping, i.e. the company, that would have been aware of it. As we previously mentioned, the Battle of the Somme was to continue past the 1st of July 1916, and after the war, when decisions were made about what to call the official battles, the Battle of the Somme was actually broken down into a number of smaller actions or battles. I think it's 12, if I remember rightly. Now, the first half of October was part of the Battle of the Transloy Ridges, and it's this action that's to see the 2nd Essex coming back down onto the Somme. When the battalion attacked on the 1st of July 1916, it was in the height of summer. Now, when they return to the front line and prepare to attack in early October, the weather has changed. And on the 9th of October, they formed up to move to a place called Trones Wood, which is marked on this map on the screen. It's that kind of weird sort of teardrop type or raindrop shaped wood in the middle of the screen. And you can see a memorial marked at the southern end of it there. The going was really difficult for them moving into this position, and the cart that carried the Lewis guns, which was the sort of light machine gun of the day, got stuck in the mud and had to be left behind with the guns being manually carried. And the 2nd Essex didn't actually arrive at Troneswood till about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, having set off at 9 in the morning, and therefore having taken 6 hours to cover a distance of 4.5 miles in a purely administrative move, not in kind of contact with the enemy in any way. Now, the battalion was to find itself spending a lot of time around a town called LesBoeufs, or LesBoeufs as a lot of the soldiers called it, and I'll probably stick to that. And it found itself in the front line near here on the 11th of October, because there was going to be an attack on the 12th. Now, the 2nd Battalion Essex was to have a supporting role in this attack, which wasn't successful. The attack was against some German trenches called Dewdrop, and you can see them marked pretty centrally, but in the lower half of the image on the screen. So it was a supporting role. So basically, the 2nd Essex had to provide 3 parties, each party to have 1 non-commissioned officer, an NCO, and 20 other ranks. And these were they were attached to the 2 assaulting battalions, which were also part of the 12th Brigade. Now, the attack was unsuccessful, but these battalions reported back that the parties had done excellent work, including acting as snipers, and that had inflicted many casualties upon the enemy. Now, one of the attacking battalions had suffered so many casualties that they asked to borrow 1 company from the 2nd Essex so it could hold its front line. And this company was tasked, it was Captain Ward, who we have met last as the bombing officer on the 1st of July 1916, who was told to take his company forward. And they took over a trench in this area called Cow Trench, and they were to witness continued attacks over the next few days, but not take part in them. And this is one of the criticisms of the British tactics at this period, is that many of the attacks were quite small, company or battalion level attacks, rather than large-scale things which would give the Germans a bigger task to deal with. Whilst in this area, the 2nd Essex pretty much just held the front line, but they still found themselves under fire, but unfortunately under British fire, because the gunners that were shelling the German lines in preparation for these number of attacks were often dropping shells short onto them. Having spent time here on the 20th of October, the 2nd Essex were brought back out the front line, returned to Troneswood, where they had a couple of days to prepare themselves, because they were then tasked with taking part in the attack on the 23rd of October from LesBoeufs, and it is going to be back towards Dewdrop Trench, which we can see here, the sort of northeast of LesBoeufs. Now, this next image is something I found in the war diary going through it, and it appears to be an order of battle. It's a list of the officers and their roles in an attack. It's not actually dated, but there's some factors on here that seem to point to it being, if not for this attack, then at some point just before it. And you can sort of play around with it on the screen to look at the details, but there's some of it's going to come back up in a little while. So one of the giveaways is that Noel Irwin is back with the battalion, and some of the other names are also going to be important in the next part. Now, the attack that was going to go against Dewdrop Trench, the plan was that the assembly trenches had been dug between the British front line and the German front line, and these were going to be occupied during the night at 2 a.m, so that by 0 hour, the troops would already be there and they could leap off from there and be much closer towards the German trenches. And the initial plan had been that the attack would take place at 11:30 a.m. on the 23rd. Now, Harold Moore was a signaller in Captain Ward's company, and he records the assembly trenches as being very deep, with steps dug in the side. They were 100 yards in front of the British front line, and there was no communication trench linking them. He felt that from the assembly trenches to the German front line was approximately 500 yards, and he described the country between the trenches as being clear and open, but that there was barbed wire in front of both the British trenches and the German trenches. There was an obstacle, and it was mud, and he describes the Somme mud very kind of deeply being a hindrance to any movement. He also mentions that they were under quite a bit of German artillery fire. Now, the attack itself, I'm just going back there. This image is the trench map we saw a moment ago, zoomed in and also mixed in with the modern day Google map type stuff. And we can see a line running up from the top to the bottom of the screen, just running to the left of number 35. That's the A1 motorway. And also where we look at these trenches here, we can see Dewdrop, Rainy Trench, and Rainy Trench actually comes up to the local communal cemetery. And we can see an Trench at the top there. That's Spectrum Trench. and those are the 3 trenches that are going to be attacked on the 23rd of October. So going back to the trench map here, the attack was postponed following consultation with the French, because the Somme was a combined offensive. On account of heavy mist, the attack didn't actually commence until 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon. And we're going to look at the war diary shortly, and it will tell us that as the troops went over the top, they were immediately hit with heavy machine gun fire, and the first 4 waves of the brigade were pretty much stopped at the jump-off point. However, more troops are committed, and they do ultimately get some people up to the German front lines and potentially into their objectives, which were behind the trenches. There is some sources that suggest some of the 2nd Essex made it into Dewdrop Trench, but if they did, it was quite a small number, and it's suggested it might be only about 30 men that actually made it that far, and that most of the officers and NCOs had become casualties. They weren't able to sustain themselves in that area. Now, Harold Moore, who gave an interview to the Imperial War Museum, and it's held on the Oral Archive, which you can access via the website, and I'd recommend you do so because you can hear him tell the story rather than me trying to relate it. But he describes the attack, saying that the British artillery was hitting the German front line as they stepped off, and he felt it knocked out some of the German machine guns, which allowed them to advance. And he said they got near the German front line before they were forced back. He said they were spaced out with 6 yards between each man, and that the battalion moved forward in 2 lines, and he was in the 2nd support line, which was about 100 yards behind the 1st line. Now, interestingly, in his account, he claims that he attacked in the early morning and the weather was fine, whereas all other accounts seem to suggest that the attack was in the afternoon, 2:30, 2:40 p.m. And if we think of the mist and stuff in the morning, suggests maybe the weather wasn't so good. And he thinks that Harold Moore suggests that one of the reasons the Germans spotted the assembly trenches and were able to shell them so accurately was that they were using observation balloons behind their lines. So if we now turn to the battalion war diary, it will give us a little bit more information about what happened on this day. And this is the entry from Monday, October the 23rd, 1916. 0 hour, 11:30 a.m. 0 hour postponed to 2:30 p.m. on account of heavy mist. At 2:30 p.m, assaulting troops went over the top, were immediately met with heavy machine gun fire. First 4 waves were stopped by German front lines. These waves were destined for Browne line, an imaginary line 400 yards from our trenches, and about 500 yards behind the enemy front line, and few crossed the enemy front line. Now, I think some of these figures of distances are a bit messed up, as we'll see as we continue on. Returning to the war diary. The second 4 waves started from assembly trenches at 2:40 p.m. Those are the ones described by Harold Moore, destined for Green Line, an imaginary line about 1,200 yards in front of our line. And they were met by heavy machine gun fire and a light enemy barrage of the 2 companies forming these lines. Only about 30 men and 2 Lewis guns reached the Browne line, where they started to dig in. Receiving no support from the flanks and the rear, and all officers and NCOs having become casualties, the remains of this party had to withdraw, and from the left company 4 men returned, and from the right company 2 Lewis guns and about 12 men. By 9 p.m, the whole line had withdrawn back to original, i.e. the assembly trenches. A few men held out in shell holes, etc., till early morning on the 24th. Now, on the evening of the 23rd, when this is written up, this is the war diary, it lists the following casualties. 5 other ranks to the field ambulance, Lieutenant N.R. M.R. Robertson wounded, 2 ORs killed, 1 OR wounded, and 1 OR missing. Now, at this point, I think the situation of the casualties was very unclear, but clearly many men were missing at this point, and by the next day, the war diary had some clarifications. This is the entry for the 24th of October, 1916. Orders received at 1 a.m. that battalion would be relieved by the Lancashire Fusiliers. Very difficult relief completed at 6 a.m. Battalion moved back into reserve in Cow Trench. Companies averaged 20 other ranks. At 10 a.m, orders received for battalion to move back to Trones Wood. By 1 p.m. Battalion having moved back, we were informed the order was not meant for us. Battalion, however, remained in bivouac for the night. Casualties: 2nd Lieutenant E.H. Lee, C.E.W. Browne, E.K.M. Omford wounded, 2nd Lieutenant A.T. Waldron missing, 14 other ranks killed, 42 wounded, 165 missing. And if we return to that ALBAT that I showed you a little while ago, we can see here that Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, who's the person that's signing the war diary theoretically, he's named. Irwin, we know he's back with the battalion. If we come down, we can see Captain Ward, and we know that he's with the battalion. And we can see that there's 577 other ranks taking part in the attack. And if you add those numbers up that we just had, it comes to somewhere in the region of 255. Continuing on with all that we saw earlier, there's Captain Ward still at the top. We can see now some names that we've just heard. C.E.W. Browne, E.J. Waldron, E.K. E.K.M. it says in this thing, Oxford or Omford, all listed as wounded. We can also see there that it says about Perkins, and that was the officer that was found in theory asleep on stand 2. And I think that note beside him says that he'd been wounded. Commonwealth War Grave Commission records now tell us that the number killed or died on that day was actually 110. And that 110 includes Second Lieutenant Waldron, that we can see there, who was platoon commander in Captain Wilmot's company. And he is now buried at Cavenagh Rouge British Cemetery. And of that 110, as far as my research can point out, about 10 of them were actually originals, men that had come over the battalion in August 1914. Other people we can consider who died on this day is Sgt Fred Adams. You can see his picture there on the right. Now, Fred Adams was the son of Mrs Adams of Waldron Road, Southend-on-Sea. He'd actually been born at Braintree, which is much further north in Essex. He'd served in the army for 20 years, fighting in the Boer War and receiving the King's South Africa Medal whilst the battalion was in Malta. He re-enlisted in the Essex Regiment at Chatham at the outbreak of the war, and if you go right back to episode 1, it talks about them being at Chatham at the time and how they proudly reported they were one of the first battalions to get all their reservists back. Fred Adams' obituary carries on. He went to France. He was wounded in the head and fight by shrapnel. Upon recovery, he again volunteered from the front and returned to France. And he was killed on 23rd of October 1916. He was wounded by a bullet and almost directly afterwards struck in the head by a shell fragment which killed him instantly. Other casualties on this day, we have Sgt George Henry Chipperfield. Now, he's the son of Georgie Henry Chipperfield of 70 Bridge Road, Stratford, London. And Stratford was sort of seen as kind of Essex in those days. He's husband of Elizabeth Chipperfield of 48 Royal Military Avenue, Cheriton, Kent. And he was actually born in West Ham and actually enlisted in Worley, which was the regimental depot of the Essex Regiment. On the right-hand side there, we've got Lance Corporal Christopher Hands. He was born in Norton Lindsay. He also enlisted in Worley, which is already said is the regimental depot, and resided in Brentwood, according to Soldiers Died in the Great War, which is one of the resources that we can get information from. Other casualties on the day, Lance Corporal Harry Sidney Lucas, who we see here on the left. He was born in Montford and enlisted in Colchester and was living in Mistley at the time of his death, or registered in Mistley, and that's a smallish town or village near Colchester. And on the right, we have Edward Lewellen. Now, that's the name he served under, but his name might have actually been Edward Tatton. There's sort of differences in sources. And he was born in Newton, also enlisted in Colchester, and was residing in Great Bromley, which is a town over sort of Colchester way. So the battalion suffered very heavily on the 23rd of October 1916. And if you look at the war in total, it was its second most costly day after the 1st of July 1916. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was renowned as being quite miserable, and the 2nd Essex shared in that misery, not just the conditions, but there was an outbreak of mumps in the battalion. But the next major period of action that they're going to have, and one that links them to a town that's quite important for the 2nd Essex in its history, is they're going to take part in the Battle of Arras on the 9th of April 1917. And that's what we're going to cover in the next episode. I hope you're enjoying these. I'm enjoying having to go back to my research and look into it all. And I've liked the fact that a few people have commented and asked questions and shared information with me, which is great. So if you are enjoying them, please do like or comment. And if you could subscribe, that will give me like that feedback loop and encouragement to carry on to the next one. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.